Okay, this first part of the lecture on the plasma membrane is going to focus on primarily what are the pieces and parts that make up the plasma membrane, and then later on in some follow-up lectures we're going to talk about more specifically about how items move across the plasma membrane into and out of the cell. First things first, what is the plasma membrane like? And I just want to really quick tell you that when you see me use the abbreviation capital P, capital M, I'm just writing out a shorthand version for plasma membrane because it gets tiring to write plasma membrane out all the way all the time. So when you see PM, just know that means plasma membrane. Now the plasma membrane is best described in terms of what it's like as being kind of like the consistency of salad dressing, you know, like a vinegar and oil salad dressing you put on your salad. It's a highly fluid membrane that surrounds the cell. And we're going to find out on the next slide what are the pieces and parts, the types of molecules that make up the plasma membrane. But right now what I want to let you know is that that plasma membrane is a very constantly dynamically moving substance. It's made up of two separate layers, one on top of each other, that I'll show you in a minute. You can kind of see the two layers here in this picture. And those two layers have also stuck around in them all these different proteins. They almost look like islands, don't they, in the plasma membrane. Well, those two layers slide past one another. It's a little like if you took your hands and put them together palm to palm, and then you rubbed your hands back and forth and slid them around. That's kind of what's happening with the plasma membrane. Those two layers slide past one another, and because these proteins are stuffed into that plasma membrane, they get moved around while the plasma membrane layers are moving past one another. And for that reason, we call the best description of the plasma membrane of what it's like the Fluid Mosaic Model. Fluid because the plasma membrane is somewhat liquid-like salad dressing. We call it a mosaic because it has proteins scattered around in it like a mosaic does. And we use that term then to describe how the plasma membrane looks and acts. Now, there's even been experiments to show that there's constant movement of this plasma membrane. Scientists took a mouse cell and they tagged it with a fluorescent dye, the plasma membrane, the proteins in the plasma membrane. Then they took a human cell and they tagged the proteins in the plasma membrane of the human cell with a different fluorescent dye. And then they united these two cells together to form one larger cell. And over time, they saw that the proteins from the human cell and the proteins from the mouse cell intermingled and mixed together. And that, to them, showed them that the plasma membrane is constantly in motion, moving around in a very fluid-like way. So what are the parts that make up the plasma membrane? Well, there are three main components. By far and away, the most common component of the plasma membrane is the phospholipids. And you will remember that phospholipids are a type of lipid. They have a backbone that's made of glycerol. And on one of the carbons of that glycerol molecule, there is a phosphate group attached, which makes for a very hydrophilic head. And that on the other end, attached to the other two carbons, are two molecules of fatty acids. And those fatty acids make up the hydrophobic tails of the phospholipid. And as you can see in this picture, there are two layers of phospholipids, and a critical thing to notice is how the hydrophilic heads are oriented out to the outside of the cell or into the inside of the cell where water is present, and that the hydrophobic tails orient towards each other in the middle. Now, that arrangement makes for some interesting issues that we're going to talk about later, such as how do items get across the plasma membrane. Items that go across the plasma membrane would logically have to be able to associate with the hydrophilic heads as well as associate with the hydrophobic tails to make it through the plasma membrane. And there aren't very many molecules that can move across the membrane and do that. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Another component of the plasma membrane are these little molecules of cholesterol. You don't see them very often, but they're scattered in and amongst the phospholipid bilayer, and their job is to lend some structural stability to the plasma membrane. The other major component of the plasma membrane are these proteins, and boy, are there a lot of them. As you can see here, all these orange blobs are proteins. Some of the proteins go all the way across the plasma membrane from one side to the other, and we call those transmembrane proteins. Some are only situated on one side of the plasma membrane. Typically, they're situated on the side of the plasma membrane that is on the inside of the cell, and they're used as anchoring points for lots of fibrous proteins to attach to, and that helps lend structure and rigidity to the inside of the cell. Now, transmembrane proteins, those proteins that I said go all the way across the plasma membrane from one side to the other, can serve a lot of different purposes, and in the next lecture I'll talk about more specifically one of those purposes, which is to serve as channels and carriers. Channels are basically proteins that have basically an open hole in them that allow for the movement of molecules through them. It's important to remember about proteins is that their shape directly relates to their function. And so if one protein is shaped to allow for potassium ions to move through it, that shaped protein will not also allow, for example, glucose molecules to pass through it. It's highly specific. Channels are usually pretty much always open, although there are some that are gated, meaning they have a door on them or a gate. Carriers are a variation on channels that help to move items across from one side of the membrane to the other, but they are not in an open position all the time. Some transmembrane proteins are used for cell recognition, such as here you can see there's a little sugar group on the outside of this protein. That sugar group is used by the cell to let the immune system know that that cell is part of you and not some foreign invader such as a bacterial cell. Now, some transmembrane proteins serve as receptors. They are sites where hormones, like this hormone molecule, can bind to the transmembrane protein and thus send a signal into the cell about some alteration that needs to occur in the metabolism of the cell. And lastly, some transmembrane proteins are enzymes that perform different chemical reactions for the cell, such as bringing two substrates together to make a larger product, or taking a large substrate and breaking it apart into two smaller products. Now, you can find other things in the plasma membrane, and of course there's a lot more than we're mentioning here. We're just giving you kind of the big ticket items. There are these things called carbohydrate chains. As I mentioned previously, they often are used as recognition molecules to let the immune system know that this cell is part of the body. They are typically, these carbohydrate chains are attached to proteins. If the protein is the main part of the molecule with a little sugar on it, we call it a glycoprotein. There are so many sugar groups attached to proteins on the outside of the plasma membrane that it's almost as if the cell is coated in a coating of sugar. And scientists call that coating of sugar the glycocalyx. Sometimes you'll also get lipids attached to the proteins instead, in which case we call those lipoproteins. All right, that's all on the plasma membrane in general. Next up is permeability.